Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring something a little bit different, a little bit shadowy, you could say.
Ooh, getting right into it.
I like it. We are. We're talking about the Dark Triad.
Ah, yes.
And you know how these personality traits can actually show up at work?
It is a fascinating area, and I think part of what makes it so fascinating is that it's not about clinical diagnoses.
Right.
It's not like we're talking about, people who are, quote, sick,
Mm-hmm.
but rather these are subtle variations of traits that probably many of us listening have encountered.
Totally. And just as a quick reminder for anyone who this is maybe their first deep dive with us,
Yeah.
the Dark Triad refers to Machiavellianism,
Right.
narcissism,
Right.
and psychopathy.
Right.
But not in the extreme pathological sense.
Yes.
We're really focusing on these as they appear in everyday personalities.
You can almost think of it as like a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
We all have some degree of these traits, but some individuals exhibit them much more strongly. And it's those stronger expressions that can really influence workplace dynamics.
For sure. And our guide for this deep dive is a 2018 article from the Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior
Okay,
by LeBreton, Shiverdecker, and Grimaldi.
great article.
And it really just gives a great overview of the research on how the Dark Triad can impact everything from individual job performance
Yeah.
to even like leadership styles.
And what I think is really interesting about this article is that it helps us understand the complexity of these traits.
Okay.
So the Dark Triad isn't always, a recipe for disaster at work.
Right.
In fact, there are some situations where these traits can be, well, let's just say unexpectedly advantageous.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of how this all plays out in the workplace, let's just take a step back and talk about personality in general.
Sure.
I think it's really helpful to set the stage to understand these specific traits.
That's a great point because personality really is how we adapt to our surroundings, right? It encompasses our motives, our needs, even our thought patterns,
Mm-hmm.
all of which ultimately shape how we think and feel and behave.
Yeah, so it's more than just like, oh, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert.
Yeah.
It's like a whole system that influences how we engage.
Exactly. And within that system, there are both what we call implicit and explicit components.
Oh, okay.
So implicit is all the stuff going on beneath the surface.
Okay.
Think unconscious biases,
Mm-hmm.
motivations, even defense mechanisms.
So kind of like the, behind-the-scenes crew of our personalities.
Precisely, yes. Working hard, but not always visible.
Exactly. Okay, so then there's the explicit side, and that's what we're primarily focusing on today with the Dark Triad.
Right.
So these are the traits that we can observe, and oftentimes we can measure them.
Yes.
And they have that more direct impact on our behavior. So it's
Yep.
kind of what we see playing out in ourselves and in other people. Okay, so when we talk about the Dark Triad, we're looking at those observable, measurable traits.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of go through and really understand each trait for what it is.
Absolutely. Let's start with Machiavellianism.
Okay.
So, imagine someone who's a master manipulator, highly strategic cunning, focused on personal gain.
Yeah.
They might be distrustful of others. They believe that the ends justify the means and really have a knack for influencing people to get what they want.
So they're basically playing the game of life on expert mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Always thinking several steps ahead and not afraid to bend the rules.
Yeah. Okay, then there's narcissism,
Yes.
which revolves around this grandiose sense of self-importance.
Right. People high in narcissism, they really crave admiration. They often exploit others to get it, and they can struggle with empathy.
Mm,
So they might be, charismatic and charming
yeah.
on the surface, but also very entitled and arrogant.
Yeah, so that classic, it's all about me type.
Right. And I'm sure all of us listening have encountered a few of those in our careers.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then finally, psychopathy.
Yes.
Often considered the most disruptive of these traits.
Yeah. And individuals high in this trait can be incredibly charming and manipulative.
Yeah.
But beneath that surface charm lies a callous disregard for others.
Right.
And so they're often lacking remorse. They seek thrills and excitement and might even engage in very impulsive or risky behaviors.
Yeah, the article actually uses the phrase social predators to describe them.
Yes, and it's a powerful image.
Yeah.
I think it really highlights the potential for harm when these traits are expressed really strongly.
Yeah.
But this is also where it's crucial to remember that we're talking about these as subclinical traits.
Right.
So we're not diagnosing disorders here. We're exploring these personality dimensions as they exist, on a continuum in everyday life.
Right. So it's about recognizing patterns of behavior, not necessarily like putting labels on people.
Exactly.
So with these definitions in mind, let's dive into how the dark triad actually plays out at work. And I think the research on job performance is particularly interesting because it's not always what you might expect.
Right. You might assume that these dark traits would automatically lead to poor performance,
Yeah.
but it's a little more complex than that.
Okay.
So, for instance, O'Boyle and colleagues, they conducted a meta-analysis in 2012,
Okay.
and they found that the relationship between dark triad traits and job performance was surprisingly weak.
Interesting.
And for narcissism, there was practically no correlation at all.
Really? So you're saying that being a narcissist might not actually hurt your performance at work?
Well, it's not quite that simple because context is key here.
Okay.
And research has shown that narcissism might be more detrimental in certain roles, so like leadership positions, for example, or in cultures that really prioritize teamwork and collaboration.
Right, because if you're in a role that really requires you to build trust and rapport
Right.
and work well with others, then having that strong narcissistic personality might not be the best fit.
Exactly. But here's where things get even more intriguing. Some recent research has actually found that under certain conditions, narcissistic CEOs can actually boost a company's performance.
Really?
So, for example, Reina and colleagues found in 2014 that narcissistic CEOs who very strongly identify with their organization actually tend to lead better performing companies.
So it's almost like a double-edged sword then, right?
Yes.
Narcissism can be destructive in some ways, but it can also be channeled in ways that can benefit a company.
Precisely. And it's not just narcissism that shows this complexity. The research on Machiavellianism and psychopathy also suggests that their impact on job performance is really highly dependent on the situation and the tasks involved.
Okay, so job performance is a little bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the dark triad.
Yeah.
But what about counterproductive work behaviors?
Hmm.
Like, surely the dark triad has a more straightforward impact on things like sabotage or theft or bullying, right?
You're right. That's where we see a clearer link.
Yeah.
Research consistently shows that all three dark triad traits are associated with increased counterproductive work behaviors, or CWBs.
So those are things like, deliberately withholding information or spreading rumors or even undermining colleagues' work.
Exactly. And more recent research has even identified specific types of CWBs that seem to be linked to each trait.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For instance, James and colleagues found in 2014 that all three dark triad traits were linked to higher levels of something called schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude.
Yeah.
Okay, so remind me what that is.
It's basically taking pleasure in the misfortune of others.
Oh, wow. That's a little unsettling.
It might sound harsh, but
If-
the research suggests it's a real phenomenon, and it really highlights just how damaging these traits can be to workplace relationships and team morale.
Okay, so maybe not the best team players.
Probably not.
Speaking of teams, though, the article also explores the impact of the dark triad on leadership. And it seems like these traits can be found in leaders at all levels, but again, the effects are complex.
Yes, that's another area where the research has turned up some fascinating and sometimes paradoxical findings.
Okay.
Spain and colleagues have done extensive reviews of this topic, and their work suggests that dark triad traits can be related to both effective and ineffective leadership.
So someone high in the dark triad could be both a good leader and a bad leader.
It really comes down to a number of factors.
Mm.
The specific traits involved the leader's self-awareness and the organizational context.
Could you give an example, like how could, say, narcissism be both beneficial and harmful?
Sure. So narcissistic leaders can be very visionary and charismatic,
Okay.
which can be inspiring and motivating to their teams,
Mm.
right? They might also be more willing to take risks, which can lead to innovation and growth. However, that same lack of empathy and tendency to exploit others can also create a very toxic work environment. And they could be prone to making impulsive decisions that prioritize their own self-interest over the good of the organization.
So it's a real tightrope walk with those kinds of leaders.
It is, and it seems like finding the right balance or maybe even channeling those narcissistic tendencies in a positive direction is key.
Yeah. Okay, what about Machiavellianism and psychopathy in leadership?
Well, Machiavellian leaders can be very strategic and cunning,
Okay.
which can be beneficial in highly competitive environments.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They might excel at negotiation and building alliances. However, their manipulative tendencies and disregard for ethical boundaries can lead to distrust and damaged relationships.
Gotcha. And what about leaders who are high in psychopathy?
Well, those high in psychopathy can be very charming and persuasive, which can be helpful for influencing others, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, their lack of empathy, impulsivity, and potential for antisocial behavior can make them quite dangerous in positions of power.
Yeah, it sounds like leadership with, a really strong dark triad influence is a little bit of a gamble.
It is. You might end up with someone brilliant and innovative, or you might get someone who wreaks havoc on the organization.
Exactly. Okay, so now that we have a better grasp on how the dark triad can impact these different aspects of work,
Yeah.
let's get practical. How can we identify these traits in others or even in ourselves? And the article provides this really helpful toolbox of assessments, and I think this is where our listeners might start to feel a little bit more empowered.
Absolutely. The good news is that there are multiple ways to measure the Dark Triad.
Okay.
Some assessments target a single trait, like the MACHV for Machiavellianism,
Okay.
or the NPI for Narcissism.
And the SRP3 for psychopathy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Then there are combined measures like the SD3, which assesses all three traits at once.
Okay.
And for a more workplace-specific perspective, there's the Hogan Development Survey, or the HDS, which measures subclinical versions of personality disorders, including those related to the Dark Triad.
So lots of options to choose from.
There are.
But the article also mentions the five-factor model, or the FFM, as a way to gain insights into the dark triad,
Yes.
even though it doesn't directly measure those traits. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Of course. So the FFM, often called the Big Five, assesses 5 broad personality traits. Openness to experience conscientiousness, extroversion agreeableness, and neuroticism. And while these don't directly map onto the Dark Triad, there are some significant correlations between them.
Okay, so certain big five traits might serve as kind of red flags for dark triad tendencies.
Exactly. O'Boyle and colleagues found in their 2015 meta-analysis that all 3 Dark Triad traits were strongly negatively correlated with agreeableness. So someone who scores very low on agreeableness might be worth a closer look in terms of, considering the potential for Dark Triad tendencies.
That's really helpful to know. But the article also mentions that people high in dark triad traits might be more likely to fake good on personality tests,
Yeah.
especially in like high-stakes situations like a job interview, which is concerning, right?
It is a challenge, and researchers are exploring ways to address this issue.
Okay.
One approach involves using what are called indirect measurement techniques.
Okay, what does that look like?
So instead of asking someone directly, are you manipulative?
Right.
You might present them with hypothetical scenarios and assess their responses, allowing you to kind of infer their underlying tendencies.
So it's like reading between the lines a little bit.
Precisely. Yeah, the article also suggests that understanding the evolutionary advantages of Dark Triad traits can help develop more effective assessment strategies.
Evolutionary advantages now. That's interesting.
It is, right?
How could these seemingly negative traits actually be beneficial from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, imagine our ancestors, competing for resources or mates.
Right.
Traits like charm, persuasiveness, and a willingness to take risks could have been quite advantageous in those situations.
So in those like short-term interactions, it kind of gives them a competitive edge?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be mindful of these tendencies, especially during job interviews, where first impressions can be really misleading.
Right.
We need to look beyond that superficial charm and assess whether their behavior actually aligns with their words over time.
So it's really about being like a detective, looking for those inconsistencies and gathering evidence before we make any judgments.
Right.
And this brings us to a point that the authors raise in their conclusion, the importance of exploring the implicit aspects of the dark triad.
Yes, this is an exciting new direction for research, and it has the potential to completely change how we understand these dark personalities.
So remind us again, what do we mean by the implicit aspects of personality?
It's all that stuff happening beneath the surface.
Okay.
The unconscious biases, motivations, and defense mechanisms that can drive our behavior without us even realizing it.
So if we've been focusing on like the tip of the iceberg with those explicit traits, the implicit stuff is like that massive hidden part underwater that we're just starting to explore.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Thanks.
And the authors argue that to really get a handle on the Dark Triad, we need to start mapping and measuring these implicit components.
Okay.
It's likely that these unconscious processes are significantly impacting how these traits are expressed and how they influence behavior.
So it's like trying to solve a mystery, but only having like half the clues.
Exactly. As we uncover these hidden pieces, we might be able to develop much more effective strategies for managing and mitigating the impact of the Dark Triad in the workplace.
Now that's a hopeful thought. So it seems like the research on the dark triad is constantly evolving.
It is.
What are some of the key areas that researchers are focused on for the future?
Well, the article highlights several promising directions.
Mm-hmm.
One area is reconciling the different frameworks used to study each trait.
Okay.
For example, there are various models of psychopathy,
Mm-hmm.
each with its own set of dimensions and nuances. So by clarifying these frameworks, researchers can create more consistent and accurate assessments.
So it's about refining our definitions and making sure everyone is on the same page when we talk about these traits.
Precisely, another important direction is exploring the specific relationships between each dark triad trait and various workplace outcomes.
Okay.
As we've seen, the impact of these traits is not always clear-cut.
Right.
It depends on a multitude of factors. The specific trait involves the organizational context, even individual differences.
So more research is needed to kind of untangle those relationships.
Absolutely. And as we gain a deeper understanding of these nuances, we can develop more targeted interventions and strategies for managing dark triad personalities in the workplace.
You know, it feels like we're only just scratching the surface of a very complex and intriguing topic.
You're absolutely right. That's what makes this research so compelling.
Mm-hmm.
The more we learn about the dark triad, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
Yeah, it really does feel vast, like we're just at the very beginning of exploring it all.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not just about, understanding these traits on an individual level, but how the dark triad impacts, organizational culture and dynamics as well.
Right. And that's such an important point. Just one dark personality can create like a ripple effect
Yeah.
throughout a whole team or even a company.
Oh, yeah.
So imagine a workplace with a leader who scores really high in Machiavellianism.
Okay.
Could that foster a culture where everyone feels like they have to be cutthroat and manipulative to get ahead?
It's a scary thought, for sure. Definitely something that needs more research. But what about on a more personal level?
Yeah.
What if, someone listening recognizes some of these dark triad tendencies in themselves? Is change even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The article we're discussing doesn't go too deeply into that, but there's definitely potential for growth, right? I mean,
Yeah.
could coaching therapy or other interventions help individuals become more aware of these tendencies and learn to manage them more effectively?
Right.
It's a question worth exploring for sure.
It is. So even if, as we talked about earlier, these traits did provide, some kind of evolutionary advantage back in the day,
Right.
we're not necessarily stuck with them, right?
No, exactly. We
Okay.
have the capacity for change and growth,
Yeah.
even when it comes to some of our most ingrained personality traits.
Right. And that's a much more hopeful perspective.
Oh, definitely.
Okay. But I'm still a little bit hung up on those assessments,
Yeah.
If people high in the dark triad are so good at manipulating and presenting like a false front,
Right.
how can we reliably spot them, especially in job interviews?
Yeah, you raise a really key point.
Yeah.
Traditional personality tests just might not be enough to catch those really skilled impression managers.
Right.
And that's why researchers are developing more sophisticated tools like those indirect measurement techniques that we talked about.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, instead of directly asking someone, are you manipulative?
Mhm.
You might present them with hypothetical scenarios and observe how they respond
Okay.
and look for those patterns that might reveal their underlying tendencies.
So yeah, it's more about being like a detective observing, gathering evidence rather than just taking people at their word.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that really interesting point that the authors raise in their conclusion.
Yeah.
The need to explore those implicit aspects of the dark triad, those unconscious elements that might be even more powerful than what we see on the surface.
Remind us one more time, what do we mean by implicit in this context?
Okay, so think of it this way. We've mostly been focusing on those explicit dark triad traits.
Okay.
So the observable actions, the conscious decisions, the things that people say. But what about all those unconscious processes that are operating beneath the surface?
Right.
The hidden biases, the underlying motives, those defense mechanisms that can drive behavior without our even being aware of it.
Yeah.
Those are the implicit aspects.
So we've been looking at the tip of the iceberg, but there's this massive submerged part that we haven't fully explored yet.
Exactly. And the authors are arguing that to really get a handle on the dark triad at work, we need to start mapping and measuring these implicit components.
All right.
It's quite possible that these unconscious processes are even more influential than the explicit ones when it comes to how these traits are expressed and how they affect other people's behavior.
That's a pretty amazing thought. It really opens up a whole new area of research.
It does.
What are some of the questions that researchers are trying to answer as they get into this?
Well, one challenge is trying to reconcile the different frameworks that are used to study each dark triad trait.
Okay.
So, for example, we have multiple models of psychopathy, and aligning those can lead to more precise and consistent assessments.
So it's about kind of creating a shared language and a more unified understanding.
Exactly. Researchers are also looking at those specific relationships between each dark triad trait and different workplace outcomes.
Right, because as we've seen, it's not always a simple or straightforward impact, right?
It isn't.
It can depend on the context, the person, the organizational culture. It's complicated.
It really is a complex web of factors.
Well, it seems like the more we learn about the Dark Triad, the more we realize we have to learn.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
It really does. But, for our listener out there, what would you say is the key takeaway from all of this?
I think the most important message is that the dark triad is not black and white. These traits are complex, they're nuanced, they can manifest in so many different ways, and by understanding that complexity, we can move beyond those simple judgments of, good versus bad personalities,
Right.
and hopefully find more effective approaches to dealing with these traits at work.
I think that's such a great point. It's not about labeling people, but it's about understanding that interplay of traits and how it all affects us.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Dark Triad.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember, knowledge is power.